Hey guys, tonight we're talking about revenge. Medieval revenge, specifically. The kind that didn't involve deep breaths, forgiveness, or being the bigger person. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Robert the Bruce did not begin his revenge story as a powerful king standing confidently on a battlefield. He began it as a man hiding in caves, sleeping badly, losing friends at an alarming rate, and slowly realizing that medieval politics was less about honor and more about who stabbed you last. He was betrayed, publicly, thoroughly. His claim to the Scottish throne collapsed so fast it barely had time to embarrass itself. Allies vanished. Supporters were executed. At one point, Robert was reduced to running for his life, which is not usually how kings imagine their career trajectory. Most people at this stage would have panicked, surrendered, or written a very sad medieval poem. Robert did none of those things. Instead, he waited, and not in a dramatic, sword-clenching way. He waited in the deeply inconvenient sense, hiding, watching, remembering names, and mentally filing away grudges like an extremely patient accountant. This waiting was not heroic. It was uncomfortable. He slept in the cold, trusted almost no one, and had enough time alone to replay every bad decision he had ever made. But that time also taught him something important. Medieval power was fragile. Men who seemed loyal today would abandon you tomorrow if the wind changed direction. Kingship, he learned, was mostly about timing and not dying long enough for circumstances to improve. Years passed. His enemies relaxed. They assumed he was finished. Medieval society loved nothing more than a fallen man who stayed fallen. Robert, inconveniently, refused to cooperate with that expectation. When he returned, he did not announce revenge. He simply started winning, quietly, one fortress at a time, one alliance at a time, no speeches, no dramatic gestures, just steady progress that made his enemies increasingly uncomfortable. Then came Bannockburn. On paper, Robert should have lost badly. The English army was larger, better equipped, and very confident. Unfortunately for them, confidence is not armor. Robert used terrain, preparation, and a memory sharpened by years of humiliation. The victory shattered English control in Scotland and crowned him king. His revenge was not loud, it was not theatrical, it was administrative. The men who mocked him lived long enough to see him succeed, and in medieval terms, that was far worse than dying quickly. Robert the Bruce didn't rush revenge. He let it mature, like a fine medieval grievance. Matilda of Tuscany did not take revenge with swords, poison, or dramatic battlefield speeches. She chose a far more devastating strategy. She simply refused to die. In medieval Europe, this was an aggressive move. Matilda was one of the most powerful women of her time, which immediately meant most emperors, popes, and rival nobles spent decades trying to sideline her, ignore her, marry her off, or quietly wait for her to disappear from history, like so many inconvenient women before her. They assumed time would solve the problem. Time, however, was not on their side. She was insulted, undermined, and openly challenged by men who believed power belonged to them by default. Some tried to take her lands. Others questioned her authority. A few assumed she was merely holding power temporarily, until a proper ruler arrived. Matilda listened politely. Then she waited. And she waited a long time. While emperors declared her irrelevant, she governed. While rivals plotted, she formed alliances. While enemies aged, fell ill, or died dramatically of medieval causes like bad water or too much ambition, Matilda stayed exactly where she was, running things, quietly, competently, annoyingly. Her revenge was subtle but brutal. She watched her enemies exhaust themselves. She watched political tides shift. She watched successors inherit grudges without inheriting the competence required to act on them. One by one, The men who tried to control her vanished from the board, some through death, others through irrelevance, which in medieval society was arguably worse. There was no final confrontation, no climactic battle, just an uncomfortable realization spreading across Europe that Matilda was still there, still powerful, still very much in charge. At some point, even her enemies stopped fighting her and started negotiating with her instead, the medieval equivalent of admitting defeat without apologizing. This kind of revenge drove people insane. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't outlaw it. You couldn't even complain without admitting failure. Matilda became a constant reminder that patience, survival, and administrative competence could defeat brute force. She didn't destroy her enemies. She outlasted them. And in medieval politics, that was the coldest revenge of all. William Wallace's revenge story is unusual, because it did not end when he did. In fact, his enemies would probably argue that it became significantly worse afterward. Wallace did not start as a grand noble with armies and titles. He started as a man who had watched his family murdered, his homeland humiliated, and English officials behave as if Scotland were an inconvenient detail. His response was not subtle. He didn't write letters. He didn't negotiate. He chose violence immediately and enthusiastically. Wallace attacked symbols of English authority wherever he could find them. Sheriffs, garrisons, tax collectors. If it represented control, it became a target. His victories were loud, embarrassing, and deeply irritating to England. This was not revenge delivered with elegance. This was revenge delivered with a large sword and very little patience. Eventually, of course, medieval reality caught up with him. Wallace was betrayed, captured, and executed in a public spectacle designed to erase him completely. England assumed that would be the end of the problem. Medieval governments loved that assumption. It was wrong. Instead of killing the rebellion, Wallace's execution transformed him into something far more dangerous, a symbol. His death did not frighten Scotland into submission. It irritated them, deeply. His story spread, exaggerated, polished, and repeated until it became impossible to ignore. Wallace, inconveniently, became immortal. Every rebellion that followed carried his name like a banner. His enemies didn't just have to deal with armies, they had to deal with memory. And memory, unlike a man, cannot be executed, quartered, or displayed on city gates. The irony is brutal. Wallace never lived to see Scotland free. He never enjoyed comfort, safety, or victory in the long term. But his revenge worked anyway. His enemies spent decades fighting a ghost they had created themselves. Every time Scotland resisted, Wallace's shadow appeared again, quietly reminding England that killing the man had solved absolutely nothing. Medieval revenge often relied on fear. Wallace's revenge relied on persistence. He did not destroy England's control personally. He made it impossible for them to ever feel secure again. In the medieval world, that kind of revenge was devastating. William Wallace did not win by surviving. He won by refusing to disappear. And that is the kind of revenge that keeps rulers awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering which mistakes history will refuse to forgive. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not take revenge quickly. That would have been uncivilized. Instead, she chose something far more effective: patience, memory, and a very long marriage. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, which unfortunately meant she married a man who absolutely could not handle that fact. King Henry, her husband, eventually decided that Eleanor's political influence, intelligence, and tendency to think independently were deeply inconvenient. His solution was not counselling, it was imprisonment. For years, Eleanor was confined, not in a dungeon, but in a comfortable, humiliating sort of captivity designed to keep her quiet and irrelevant. Henry assumed that time would soften her, that isolation would erase her influence, and that eventually she would fade into the background like an old tapestry no one remembered to dust. Henry misunderstood Eleanor completely. While confined, Eleanor did not forget. She observed. She remembered every insult, every restriction, every moment she was treated as a problem rather than a partner. She also outlived Henry, which immediately improved her circumstances. The moment Henry died, Eleanor stepped out of captivity and back into power as if she had merely been waiting for a meeting to end. And then she began dismantling everything her husband had built to sideline her. She arranged alliances, she ruled territories, she guided the reigns of her sons, she travelled across Europe issuing commands while the memory of her confinement quietly followed her everywhere. Her revenge was elegant. She did not publicly condemn Henry. She did not erase his legacy outright. She did something far more painful. She made herself indispensable. While Henry was remembered largely for his failures, Eleanor became the enduring force behind multiple reigns, multiple kingdoms, and an entire generation of European politics. The man who tried to silence her became a historical footnote in her story. Eleanor's revenge was not about anger. It was about correction. She simply ensured that history remembered who truly held power. In medieval society, memory was everything, and Eleanor controlled hers. This was not revenge with blood. This was revenge with legacy. She proved a dangerous truth that medieval men learned far too late. If you lock a woman like Eleanor away, she does not disappear. She waits. And when she returns, she does not raise her voice. She raises the standard and rewrites the narrative. Vlad the Impaler believed in revenge the way some people believe in interior design, with a theme, a message, and absolutely no subtlety whatsoever. As a child, Vlad was taken hostage, humiliated, and forced to watch his family's power collapse, while foreign rulers treated his homeland like a welcome mat. This was not a character-building experience. This was a character-sharpening experience. Vlad learned early that mercy was optional, and fear was far more reliable. When he finally returned to power, Vlad did not rush. He invited his enemies to dinner. This was a mistake, on their part. Vlad had a deep appreciation for symbolism. He understood that killing your enemies quietly was inefficient. Killing them publicly, creatively, and in large numbers, however, sent a message that tended to stick. His chosen method of execution was impalement, not because it was fast, humane, or popular, but because it was unforgettable. When rivals betrayed him, he didn't chase them down immediately. He let them feel safe first. He let them attend banquets, smile, drink wine, and enjoy the illusion of normalcy. Then he introduced consequences. Entire groups of nobles were executed in ways designed to be seen from miles away. Forests of impaled bodies became warnings, carefully arranged to discourage further disobedience. This wasn't madness. This was policy. Invading armies approaching Vlad's territory reportedly stopped, stared, and reconsidered their life choices. Soldiers who expected resistance instead found psychological warfare on an industrial scale. The message was clear. You could fight Vlad, but you would not enjoy the experience. His revenge was not personal in the modern sense. It was strategic. Vlad wanted to make betrayal feel expensive. Painfully expensive. Ideally expensive enough that people would choose literally any other option. Did this make him popular? No. Did it make him effective? Unfortunately, yes. Enemies remembered him long after he was gone. His name became shorthand for terror, punishment, and consequences delivered with theatrical flair. Even centuries later, his reputation still does most of the work for him. Vlad did not forgive. He did not forget. He advertised. In medieval Europe, revenge often restored honor. Vlad went further. He weaponized it, and while history debates his sanity, it cannot debate his results. Sometimes revenge isn't about balance. Sometimes it's about making sure no one ever tries again. Some medieval revenge stories are deeply personal. The Sicilian Vespers was not one of them. This was revenge as a community effort, organized, synchronized, and carried out by people who had finally decided they were done being polite. For years, Sicily lived under foreign rule that treated the island less like a kingdom and more like a badly managed occupation zone. Taxes were heavy, local customs were ignored, and foreign soldiers behaved like they owned the place, because technically they did. This arrangement was deeply unpopular, which in medieval terms meant everyone smiled in public and seethed privately. The breaking point came during an evening church service. A single incident, humiliating, public, and very poorly timed, ignited something that had been building for years. The bells rang for evening prayers, and instead of spiritual reflection, the population collectively decided it was time to settle accounts. What followed was not chaos. That's the unsettling part. It was coordinated. Locals identified their targets carefully. Foreign soldiers and officials were attacked while neighbours protected neighbours. Passwords were used to identify outsiders. If you failed the test, you failed permanently. This was revenge with logistics. By the time the violence ended, thousands were dead. Entire ruling structures collapsed in a matter of days. The occupiers had assumed their power was secure. They had mistaken silence for acceptance. A classic medieval error. The most uncomfortable part for historians is how efficient it all was. There was no single leader, no dramatic speech, no villain monologue, just a shared understanding that the time for restraint had expired. Revenge didn't roar. It moved quickly, quietly, and decisively. Foreign powers were shocked. They always are. They asked how such a thing could happen so suddenly. The answer, as always, was simple. It wasn't sudden at all. It was patient. The Sicilian Vespers became legendary not because of its brutality, medieval Europe was full of that, but because of its unity. Revenge wasn't delivered by a king or an army. It was delivered by shopkeepers, farmers, priests, and neighbours who had reached the same conclusion independently. This was not revenge driven by anger alone. It was revenge driven by exhaustion. And that may be the most dangerous kind of all, because when an entire population agrees that revenge is necessary, there is no negotiating, no appealing to mercy, and no pretending things will calm down soon. They already waited long enough. King John of England had a remarkable talent for turning allies into enemies, not through dramatic betrayal or fiery speeches, but through something far more effective. Relentless incompetence mixed with casual cruelty. He taxed heavily, broke promises enthusiastically, and treated his nobles like disposable furniture. Eventually, the nobles decided they had had enough furniture. This was not a sudden rebellion. It was a slow burn. The English barons watched John lose wars, squander resources, and humiliate the crown repeatedly. They complained. He ignored them. They warned him. He mocked them. Medieval rulers often forgot one crucial detail. Angry nobles were not peasants. They had money, castles, and a worrying number of swords. When the barons finally acted, they didn't storm the palace screaming revenge. That would have been messy. Instead, they cornered John and forced him to sign a document that humiliated him permanently. The Magna Carta was not a peace agreement. It was revenge disguised as legality. Every clause was a reminder of John's failures. It limited his power, restrained his authority, and ensured that future kings would remember exactly what happened when they pushed their nobles too far. It was the medieval equivalent of being forced to publicly acknowledge you were wrong, in writing, forever. John, naturally, hated it. He tried to undo it immediately, appealing to the Pope and declaring the Charter invalid. This only made him look weaker, which was impressive considering his previous performance. The barons, meanwhile, had achieved something far more lasting than execution. They had broken the myth of absolute kingship. This was revenge without bloodshed. No executions, no sieges. Just a king forced to admit, on parchment, that he could not be trusted to rule unchecked. In medieval politics, that was devastating. John died not long after, miserable and angry. The document survived him. Every time future kings encountered limits on their power, John's failure echoed quietly in the background. The barons didn't destroy him physically, they dismantled his authority. And in a world where power was everything, that was the cleanest revenge imaginable. King John lost battles. He lost respect. And finally, he lost the illusion that he ruled by divine right alone. all because a group of nobles decided revenge didn't need swords, just ink. Isabella of France did not scream, threaten, or dramatically flip tables when her husband sidelined and humiliated her. That would have been undignified. Instead, she did something far more dangerous in medieval politics. She paid attention. Married to King Edward, Isabella found herself ignored, publicly disrespected, and replaced in influence by favourites who seemed to appear at court purely to test her patience. Edward assumed his wife would tolerate this arrangement indefinitely. After all, medieval queens were expected to smile politely and accept whatever nonsense was happening around them. Isabella accepted nothing. She waited. She watched alliances form and collapse. She learned who disliked the king, who felt insulted, and who was simply waiting for permission to act. She travelled abroad under the reasonable excuse of diplomacy and returned with something far more useful than goodwill: support. When Isabella finally moved, it was not loud. There were no fiery speeches about betrayal. She returned with an army, landed in England, and discovered that almost no one was willing to defend the king. This is always an awkward moment for a ruler. Edward was captured, deposed, and removed from power with shocking efficiency. Isabella did not need to personally raise a sword. The system collapsed around him naturally, like a poorly built scaffold. His reign ended not with a dramatic battle, but with quiet confinement and a deeply suspicious death that historians continue to discuss carefully. This was revenge executed with paperwork, timing, and an excellent understanding of human weakness. Isabella did not destroy the kingdom. She did not burn cities. She simply removed the man who had made her irrelevant and replaced him with someone more cooperative. In medieval terms, this was an outstanding outcome. Her revenge was subtle enough that some chroniclers barely recognized it as revenge at all. They described it as political necessity, stability, or correction. Isabella presumably did not correct them. The lesson here is uncomfortable but clear. Medieval revenge did not always involve blood. Sometimes it involved patience, alliances, and letting your enemy remain convinced they were safe, right up until they were not. Isabella of France did not shout. She did not rush. She did not forgive. She waited until removing a king felt less like rebellion and more like housekeeping. And that, in medieval Europe, was the most elegant revenge imaginable. Jan Hus did not live to enjoy his revenge, which in medieval history is surprisingly common and deeply inconvenient for the people who thought killing him would solve everything. Hus was a reformer, a preacher, and, most importantly, a man who would not stop talking about corruption in the church. This alone made him dangerous. When he was summoned to a council under a promise of safe conduct, he did what any reasonable medieval intellectual would do. He trusted it. This was a mistake. Hus was arrested, tried, and executed anyway, burned publicly in a very dramatic attempt to prove that authority had won. The message was clear: speak out, and this is what happens. The authorities assumed fear would do the rest. It did not. Instead of silencing dissent, Hus's execution irritated an entire region. His followers did not react immediately. They didn't riot wildly and burn everything down overnight. That would have been too easy to suppress. Instead, they organized. They armed themselves. They remembered. What followed were the Hussite Wars, a series of rebellions so persistent that even professional armies struggled to contain them. Peasant soldiers, armed with wagons, farm tools, and unearned confidence, repeatedly defeated forces that were supposed to crush them. Every victory carried the same unspoken message. Killing Hus had made things worse. This is the cruel irony of medieval revenge. Executing a man might remove a voice, but it can also create a symbol. Symbols are extremely difficult to execute. Hus's enemies spent years fighting not just soldiers but ideas that had already proven immune to fire. Each attempt to stamp out the movement only confirmed Hus's warnings about corruption and abuse of power. His death became evidence, not deterrence. In the end, concessions were made. Reforms were negotiated. Authority adjusted itself quietly, pretending this was always part of the plan. Hus, meanwhile, remained dead, but victorious in the only way medieval history allows, by forcing his enemies to change. His revenge was delayed, indirect, and unstoppable. He never raised a sword. He never saw the outcome. And yet his enemies paid for his execution many times over. Jan Hus did not defeat his opponents in life. He defeated them by refusing to be forgotten. In medieval Europe, memory was power, and Hus weaponized it perfectly, even from the grave. If medieval Europe had offered awards for internal family destruction, the Angevin dynasty would have won every category, and still complained the judging was unfair. This was a family that treated revenge not as an emotional reaction, but as a deeply respected inheritance passed down from parent to child, like land or titles. The Angevin household was not a place of warmth. It was a place of ambition, suspicion, and an unspoken understanding that today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, especially if they shared your last name. Fathers distrusted sons. Sons plotted against fathers. Brothers competed with the enthusiasm of people who knew only one of them would still be alive or relevant at the end. King Henry, the family patriarch, discovered early that raising powerful sons was a terrible idea. Each son felt entitled to rule immediately, preferably without waiting for inconvenient details like their father's death. Henry responded by dividing lands, making promises, and breaking them repeatedly, a strategy that somehow made everything worse. The sons revolted, constantly. They allied with enemies, raised armies, and betrayed one another with impressive speed. Family dinners must have been deeply uncomfortable, assuming they happened at all. Medieval chroniclers stopped pretending this was normal behavior and started documenting it like a slow-motion disaster. Revenge within the Angevin family was not explosive. It was methodical. If one son rebelled and failed, he waited. If a brother gained advantage, another undermined him quietly. Nobody forgot anything. Apologies were treated as temporary ceasefires at best. What makes this revenge story remarkable is how little anyone learned. Each generation repeated the same mistakes with confidence, convinced they would be the exception. They were not. Betrayal bred betrayal. Revenge produced more revenge, and the dynasty slowly consumed itself from the inside. Enemies outside the family barely had to intervene. They simply watched and waited. When the Angevins weakened themselves enough, rivals stepped in and claimed what was left. This is the medieval equivalent of leaving your door unlocked because you assume the house will collapse on its own. In the end, the Angevin revenge cycle did not elevate anyone. It did not restore honour. It simply ensured that no one enjoyed power for very long. The Angevins did not lose their dynasty to a single enemy. They lost it to each other. And that may be the most medieval revenge story of all. Scanderbeg's revenge story begins with one of history's most inconvenient childhoods. Taken hostage as a boy, raised by an empire that expected his loyalty, and trained to serve the very power that had crushed his homeland, Scanderbeg spent years smiling politely while filing away grievances like a man planning the longest to-do list in medieval history. To his captors, he was a success story. Educated, disciplined, loyal on the surface. The perfect example of how conquest could be made permanent. They trusted him. They promoted him. They assumed he had forgotten where he came from. He had not. Scanderbeg waited, and he waited properly. He learned how armies moved. He learned how commanders thought. He learned which rules were flexible and which were quietly ignored when convenient. Most importantly, he learned patience, the kind that only develops when revenge is impossible right now, but inevitable later. When the moment finally came, it arrived suddenly and politely. Scanderbeg defected, returned home, and reclaimed his ancestral lands with a speed that left everyone involved deeply embarrassed. Fortresses fell, alliances formed, a rebellion ignited that refused to burn out, no matter how many resources were thrown at it. This was not reckless revenge. This was revenge prepared with insider knowledge. Empire after empire assumed the rebellion would collapse. It did not. They assumed overwhelming force would solve the problem. It did not. Scanderbeg fought smarter, not louder. He avoided battles he could not win, struck where least expected, and made sure every victory was visible enough to inspire confidence and irritation in equal measure. The most insulting part for his enemies was how long it lasted. Decades. Years of campaigns, defeats, regrouping, and renewed resistance. Empires do not enjoy being delayed by one man and a determined population with very strong opinions about independence. Skanderbeg's revenge was not about destruction. It was about denial. He denied the empire peace. He denied them certainty. He denied them the satisfaction of finishing what they started. And he did it while outnumbered, outgunned, and relentlessly underestimated. This was revenge served slowly, deliberately, and with a deep understanding of human arrogance. The empire that took his childhood spent the rest of his life failing to take his homeland. Skanderbeg did not rush revenge. He lived inside it. And in medieval history, few revenges were as patient or as effective as that. Medieval revenge had many styles, but one of its favourites was hospitality. The Black Dinner of Scotland is proof that in the Middle Ages, accepting an invitation could be a fatal error, especially if the host smiled a little too politely. Two young noble brothers were invited to a feast under the promise of safety. This was not unusual. Feasts were meant to signal reconciliation, goodwill, and the temporary suspension of murderous intent. The boys arrived expecting food, conversation, and perhaps mild political manipulation. What they got instead was a lesson in medieval symbolism. Midway through the meal, servants entered carrying a black cloth and placed it on the table. In medieval culture, this was not subtle. This was not decorative. This was the equivalent of a handwritten note reading, "You are about to regret attending this dinner." The message was clear. The guests were arrested immediately. Accusations were read. Charges were invented with impressive speed. The boys were executed shortly afterward, having barely finished their meal. Dessert, regrettably, was cancelled. This was revenge masquerading as justice. Their family had grown too powerful, too influential, and too threatening to the ruling authority. Rather than fight them openly, which would have been messy and uncertain, the solution was to eliminate them quietly under the guise of lawful procedure. Medieval rulers adored this approach. It allowed them to claim moral high ground while actively committing betrayal. What makes the Black Dinner particularly chilling is its efficiency. There was no trial in any meaningful sense, no defence, no opportunity for escape. The entire event was designed to feel inevitable the moment the cloth touched the table. The political message was unmistakable. Trust was optional, power was not. This form of revenge didn't rely on rage or spectacle. It relied on ritual. The setting was calm. The tone was civil. The outcome was lethal. Medieval revenge often worked best when it pretended to be reasonable. The aftermath lingered for years. The families involved did not forget. Scotland did not forget. The event became a warning passed down through generations. When invited to dinner by someone who benefits from your absence, eat cautiously. The Black Dinner wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't even require swords at the table. It simply reminded everyone that in medieval politics, revenge could arrive quietly, on a plate, while everyone was still pretending to be friends. Charles the Bold had a gift for making enemies. Not accidentally, deliberately, repeatedly. He believed intimidation was leadership, arrogance was strength, and that no one would ever coordinate long enough to stop him. Medieval history loves this type of man because it knows how the story ends. Charles ruled Burgundy with ambition bordering on obsession. He wanted expansion, glory, and recognition as a major European power. To achieve this, he humiliated rivals publicly, threatened allies privately, and dismissed warnings with the confidence of someone who had never been truly punished for bad behaviour. Naturally, people remembered. Rather than confronting Charles directly, his enemies did something far more dangerous. They waited. Swiss forces, rival nobles, and neighbouring powers quietly coordinated. Grievances piled up. Insults were catalogued. Each slight became another reason to cooperate. Charles, meanwhile, mistook silence for fear, a classic medieval error. When conflict finally came, it was not a heroic duel. It was a series of disasters. Charles underestimated terrain, overestimated loyalty, and assumed his reputation would carry him through battles that required actual planning. It did not. His armies suffered crushing defeats. Supplies failed, allies vanished. And when Charles himself fell in battle, his body was left unrecognized for days. A deeply symbolic ending for a man who had insisted everyone acknowledge his greatness. The revenge here was not delivered by one person, it was delivered by everyone Charles had offended. This was collective memory turning into action. No speeches, no declarations, just coordination fueled by long-standing resentment. What makes this revenge particularly medieval is its inevitability. Charles did not lose because he was unlucky. He lost because he had spent years creating the conditions for his own destruction. Every insult, every threat, every moment of arrogance returned with interest. His enemies did not need to exaggerate his flaws. They simply waited for him to face consequences. Charles the Bold did not die misunderstood. He died correctly assessed. In medieval Europe, reputation was everything. Charles built his on fear and intimidation. When that reputation failed to protect him, nothing remained. This was revenge without drama, revenge without mercy, revenge delivered by history itself. Not all medieval revenge involved blood, screaming, or inconveniently placed pikes. Some of the most devastating revenge was administrative, spiritual, and delivered with paperwork. The kind of revenge that ruins your life quietly, while everyone insists it is perfectly lawful. The Avignon papacy emerged after a series of humiliations inflicted on the papacy by secular rulers who decided that popes were useful, but only when obedient. Kings pressured, threatened, and occasionally kidnapped popes, treating spiritual authority like a mildly annoying department that needed restructuring. The papacy did not forget this. It simply waited. When the opportunity came, popes relocated to Avignon, conveniently aligning themselves with friendly monarchs and distancing themselves from hostile ones. This move was framed as practical, sensible, temporary. Medieval institutions loved pretending revenge was just logistics. From Avignon, the papacy began applying pressure the medieval way: excommunication, interdicts, and spiritual sanctions that turned entire kingdoms into religious no-go zones. Weddings stopped, burials halted, churches closed, the population panicked. Rulers suddenly discovered that annoying the Pope came with side effects. This was revenge at scale. Kings who had once bullied the papacy now found themselves negotiating, apologizing, or quietly undoing policies to regain favor. The papacy never raised an army. It didn't need to. It weaponized belief, tradition, and the very real fear of eternal consequences. What makes this revenge especially effective is how deniable it was. Popes could insist they were acting purely on spiritual principle. They were not angry. They were disappointed. Medieval rulers learned quickly that disappointment from the church was far worse than anger. The Avignon papacy wasn't about domination. It was about reminder. A reminder that while kings ruled bodies, the church ruled souls, and souls were significantly harder to replace. This revenge unfolded slowly, across years and borders. There was no single moment of victory, just a steady realization spreading through Europe that humiliating the papacy had been a catastrophic miscalculation. No swords were drawn, no castles were burned, but entire kingdoms were brought to their knees anyway. In medieval Europe, revenge didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered Latin phrases and waited for rulers to panic. By the time we reach the end of these stories, one uncomfortable truth becomes clear. Medieval revenge was rarely about emotion. It wasn't about losing control, shouting, or acting in the heat of the moment. That kind of revenge burned out quickly. Medieval revenge was colder, calculated, structured, and most importantly, patient. People did not seek revenge to feel better. They sought it to restore balance. Honor had been damaged, authority challenged, memory insulted. Revenge was the mechanism by which the medieval world corrected itself. often brutally, sometimes quietly, but always deliberately. This is why medieval revenge took so long. Years passed, decades passed, entire lifetimes passed. Grudges were not forgotten because forgetting meant accepting weakness. And weakness, in a world built on hierarchy, was dangerous. What makes these stories unsettling isn't their violence. Medieval Europe was always violent, but their restraint. Many of the most effective revenges came from waiting, watching, and allowing enemies to make mistakes on their own. Kings were not toppled in a fit of rage. They were dismantled through alliances, paperwork, symbolism, and timing. Sometimes the avenger didn't even live to see the outcome. Modern people often ask why medieval societies seemed so obsessed with revenge. The answer is simple. There were no reliable systems to guarantee justice. Courts were biased. Laws favoured the powerful. Mercy was unpredictable. Revenge filled the gap. And once revenge began, it rarely stopped at one person. Families inherited it. Kingdoms remembered it. Entire populations carried it forward like unfinished business. Forgiveness existed, but it was considered a luxury, something you could afford only when power was secure. The irony is that medieval revenge often succeeded. It removed tyrants, it humbled kings, it forced institutions to change, but it also created cycles that consumed generations, ensuring that no victory was ever clean or permanent. In the end, medieval revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about memory. People wanted to be remembered, as wronged, as justified, as avenged. And history, quietly and mercilessly, kept those records long after everyone involved was gone. So when we look back at these stories, we aren't just watching people settle scores. We're watching a world trying to impose order in the only way it knew how, not through forgiveness, but through consequences. And in medieval history, consequences had very long memories. Ludwig van Beethoven's life begins in the modest city of Bonn, in the year 1770, far from glittering salons or imperial courts. His childhood was not wrapped in encouragement or warmth, but in expectation, heavy, urgent, and often cruel. Music entered his life early, not as a joy, but as a duty. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was determined to mould his son into a prodigy, a public miracle that would lift the family out of mediocrity. Whether Ludwig wanted this role or not was irrelevant. The piano waited, the violin waited, and so did the long nights. Johann's teaching style relied more on fear than inspiration. Lessons stretched late into the evening. Errors were not corrected patiently. They were punished. Neighbours would later recall hearing a small boy crying while scales echoed through the walls. Yet even under this pressure, something extraordinary took root. Ludwig did not merely memorize music. He questioned it. He listened for structure, tension, and emotion long before he had words to describe them. Unlike other child performers, he was never fully comfortable on display. When pushed before audiences as a wonder child, he appeared awkward and intense, more focused on the keyboard than the room. Applause did not excite him. Silence afterward interested him more. From an early age, he seemed to sense that music was not about approval. It was about expression. Bonn itself played a quiet but crucial role. It was a small court city, but unusually open to Enlightenment ideas. Intellectual discussions floated through salons and taverns. Books circulated. Ideas mattered. Beethoven absorbed this atmosphere deeply. While still a teenager, he found mentors who recognized that his talent went beyond technical skill. They encouraged him to compose, not just perform, to create rather than imitate. By his early teens, Beethoven was already working as a court musician, supporting his family as his father's reliability declined. Responsibility arrived early. Childhood ended quickly. But this hardship forged independence, discipline, and a stubborn refusal to submit to limits, traits that would define his life. This was not the beginning of a polished genius. It was the origin of a fighter, a boy shaped by pressure, sharpened by struggle, and already listening for a sound that existed beyond the notes on the page, a sound that belonged only to him. When Ludwig van Beethoven left Bonn for Vienna in the early 1790s, he was not arriving as a nobody, but neither was he a legend. Vienna was the musical capital of Europe, a city swollen with talent, ambition, and egos. Every street seemed to echo with symphonies, quartets, and reputations being built or destroyed. Beethoven arrived carrying recommendations, raw confidence, and a quiet certainty that he did not intend to fit in. At first, he did what was necessary. He studied with established masters, absorbed the formal rules of composition, and learned how the musical world functioned. On paper, he followed tradition. In practice, he tested its limits. Even as a young pianist, his playing startled audiences. He did not perform politely. He attacked the keyboard, stretching tempo, emphasizing contrasts, improvising with an intensity that felt almost confrontational. Listeners were not always sure whether they were witnessing brilliance or recklessness. Vienna quickly noticed him, not just as a composer, but as a force. Aristocrats invited him into their salons, not because he was charming, but because he was unforgettable. Beethoven had little patience for social niceties. He dressed carelessly. He spoke bluntly. He did not flatter patrons the way others did. Yet his talent was so undeniable that doors kept opening anyway. This combination of defiance and genius became his signature. Unlike many composers who wrote primarily to please employers, Beethoven treated music as something personal, almost moral. He believed it should say something about struggle, joy, rage, triumph. Early works still echoed the classical elegance of the era, but beneath the surface, something new was stirring. Rhythms grew bolder, dynamics more extreme, emotion more exposed. He was already pushing against the idea that music should remain restrained and balanced. At the piano, improvisation became his battlefield. He would challenge other musicians publicly, engaging in spontaneous musical duels that often left rivals humiliated. These performances built his reputation faster than printed compositions ever could. Word spread quickly. This man was dangerous, not physically, but artistically. By the end of his first years in Vienna, Beethoven had secured something rare. He was not merely accepted, he was anticipated. People wanted to hear what he would do next, partly because they sensed he might break something in the process. The city had given him opportunity. In return, Beethoven was preparing to reshape its musical future, whether Vienna was ready or not. At the height of his rising fame, when Vienna had begun to accept Ludwig van Beethoven as more than a curiosity, an unthinkable problem emerged. He began to lose his hearing. At first, it was subtle, a ringing that refused to leave, a dullness at the edges of sound. Beethoven tried to ignore it. He was young, successful. This was not how genius was supposed to unfold. But the symptoms worsened. Conversations became exhausting. High tones slipped away. Music, the very thing that defined him, began to fracture. For a composer whose identity was built on sound, this was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Beethoven withdrew socially, often appearing irritable or aloof. In reality, he was terrified of being exposed. Deafness, in his world, was a professional death sentence. In 1802, he retreated to the village of Heiligenstadt, hoping rest would cure what doctors could not explain. There, alone and desperate, he confronted the truth he had avoided. His hearing was not returning. The isolation, the shame, and the fear crushed him. In a letter to his brothers, never sent but preserved, Beethoven confessed that he had considered ending his life. Music was the only thing that stopped him. He could not leave the world, he wrote, without saying everything he still had inside him. This moment marked a turning point. Instead of surrendering, Beethoven hardened. He accepted his condition, not calmly, but defiantly. If he could no longer hear as others did, he would compose as no one else dared. His music began to change, structures expanded. Emotional extremes intensified. Silence itself became meaningful. He was no longer writing to entertain. He was writing to survive. Paradoxically, as his hearing declined, his imagination grew louder. He no longer relied on sound as it existed in the room, but on sound as it existed in his mind. This internalization freed him. Music was no longer bound to polite expectation or physical limitation. It became personal, confrontational, and monumental. The Heiligenstadt crisis did not end Beethoven's career. It ignited it. From this point forward, every composition carried an undercurrent of resistance, against fate, against weakness, against silence itself. The tragedy did not soften him, it sharpened him. And from this struggle, a new kind of music was about to emerge. Music forged not from what he could hear, but from what he refused to lose. With his decision to live and compose on his own terms, Beethoven entered what scholars later called his heroic phase, though at the time it felt more like open rebellion. Classical music, as Vienna understood it, prized balance, elegance, and restraint. Beethoven respected these rules just enough to know exactly how to break them. His compositions grew larger, louder, and more emotionally exposed. Symphonies stretched beyond traditional limits. Movements became longer, more dramatic, and less predictable. Sudden silences interrupted storms of sound. Gentle themes were shattered by violence, then rebuilt stronger. Audiences were no longer being entertained. They were being challenged. The turning point came with works like the Third Symphony. What listeners expected to be polite background music instead arrived like a declaration. This was not music for salons. This was music that demanded attention, even confrontation. Some listeners were stunned, others were offended. A few understood that something irreversible had happened. Beethoven was no longer writing as a servant to tradition or aristocracy. He positioned himself as an independent artist, a radical idea at the time. He rejected permanent court appointments, choosing instead to live off commissions and patronage that did not dictate his voice. This freedom came at a cost. His finances were unstable, his personal life chaotic, but creatively he was untouchable. He was. As his hearing continued to deteriorate, his focus shifted further inward. He trusted his inner ear completely. Sketchbooks filled with obsessive revisions, tiny changes made and remade until the emotional weight felt right. Nothing was accidental. What sounded wild and spontaneous to listeners was actually the result of relentless control. Critics struggled to keep up. Some accused him of excess, of ugliness, of abandoning beauty altogether. Beethoven did not care. He believed beauty could include struggle, tension, even pain. Music to him was not decoration, it was truth. This period reshaped what composition could be. No longer confined to pleasing symmetry, music could now tell stories of conflict and triumph without words. Beethoven had cracked open the classical form and poured his inner life into it. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. The composer who once feared silence was now redefining sound itself. Not as something polite and ornamental, but as something human, flawed, and fiercely alive. As Beethoven's music grew bolder, his personal life narrowed. The man who filled concert halls with sound increasingly lived in silence and solitude. His hearing loss was no longer a secret to himself, but it remained something he fought to hide from others. Conversations were strained. Social gatherings became humiliating puzzles of misheard words and forced smiles. Slowly, deliberately, Beethoven withdrew. This isolation sharpened his temperament. He was famously difficult, suspicious of friends, hostile to servants, quick to anger. Yet beneath the outbursts was fear. Every social failure reminded him of what he was losing. He could command orchestras on paper, but struggled to order a meal without confusion. Pride kept him from admitting weakness. Loneliness became the price of independence. At the same time, his emotional life burned intensely. Beethoven longed for companionship and love. but his relationships were tangled and often doomed from the start. He fell repeatedly for women who were socially unavailable. Aristocrats he could admire, but never fully claim. Letters revealed deep tenderness, yearning, and frustration. One famous correspondence, addressed to an unnamed immortal beloved, exposes a man capable of profound devotion, yet unable to reconcile love with the demands of his art and his circumstances. Music became his refuge and his weapon. During these years, his compositions balanced fury and intimacy. Explosive passages clashed with moments of aching vulnerability. Piano sonatas, string quartets, and symphonies carried emotional contradictions that mirrored his inner life. He was no longer simply expressing struggle. He was living inside it. Financial instability added pressure. Though supported by patrons, payments were inconsistent, and Beethoven had little talent for managing money. He moved constantly, changing apartments in search of quiet or better conditions, often leaving chaos behind. His daily life was disordered, but his work remained obsessively controlled. On the page, everything had purpose. This period reveals a crucial truth about Beethoven. His genius was not separate from his suffering. It was shaped by it. The isolation did not silence him. It forced him inward, where his most personal music took form. He may have pushed people away, but he pulled humanity closer through sound. The world often remembers Beethoven as a monument, stern, heroic, untouchable. In reality, these years show a man raw with contradiction, desperate for connection, fiercely independent, wounded yet unyielding. And still, against silence, he continued to write. By the second decade of the 19th century, Beethoven crossed an invisible line. His hearing was no longer merely impaired, it was largely gone. Public performance became impossible. The composer who once dominated the piano with physical force now lived in near total silence. For most musicians, this would have ended everything. For Beethoven, it changed the nature of creation itself. He adapted in practical ways first. Conversation books replaced spoken dialogue, allowing visitors to write their questions while he replied aloud or in writing. He pressed his ear to the piano, feeling vibrations through bone and wood. But gradually, even these physical connections mattered less. Beethoven was no longer composing for the ear alone. He was composing from memory, structure, and inner necessity. Something remarkable happened during this period. As his connection to the external world faded, his music became freer than ever. Forms loosened, expectations dissolved. He no longer felt bound to audience reaction, because he could not hear it anyway. What remained was intention. Every note existed because it had to. The late works begin to reflect this transformation. They are strange, intimate, and sometimes unsettling. Melodies fragment and reform. Time stretches. Silence becomes active, almost expressive. These pieces do not explain themselves easily. They require patience. They ask the listener to meet the composer halfway. Contemporaries were often confused. Some thought Beethoven had lost control. Others whispered that deafness had damaged his judgment. But what they were witnessing was not decline. It was transcendence. Beethoven was no longer writing for courts, critics, or even performers. He was writing for something abstract and internal. Music had become thought. This phase also deepened the spiritual dimension of his work. Without religious dogma, Beethoven explored ideas of struggle, reconciliation, and unity. Sound became a language for meaning beyond words. Even joy, when it appeared, felt earned, wrestled from chaos rather than gifted. Isolation still weighed heavily on him, but it no longer defined him. He had crossed into a private territory where loss could not reach. Deafness had taken sound, but it had not taken music. In a paradox that still defies explanation, Beethoven was hearing more than ever. Not with his ears, but with his entire being. The world he inhabited grew smaller. The universe inside him grew vast. By the time Beethoven began shaping what would become his Ninth Symphony, he was living almost entirely apart from the world that once celebrated him. Deaf, isolated, and physically deteriorating, he nevertheless conceived a work unlike anything music had known before. This was not just another symphony. It was a summation of struggle, resistance, and a lifelong refusal to surrender. The idea of setting voices inside a symphony was radical. Instrumental music had long been considered a complete, self-contained form. To introduce human voices, and worse, a philosophical poem, risked ridicule. Beethoven did not care. He had been carrying Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy for decades, waiting for the right moment. Now, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose, he unleashed it. The Ninth Symphony does not arrive gently. It wrestles its way forward, built on tension and instability. Themes struggle to take shape, collapse, and try again. When the final movement begins, earlier ideas are rejected one by one, as if the music itself is searching for meaning. Only then